I was going to say unenviable, but maybe it's not unenviable, position of trying to introduce the concept of environment and people and how they go hand in hand or in conflict over time, and somehow providing a context that in recent years has involved a new focus called epigenetics. And here we're talking about what kinds of genetic responses are elicited by what kinds of environmental demands and how those operate over time in the interest of prevention. So I'm hoping that we can make some bridges across the morning that gives us a sense of context. Let's see. Oh, I'm supposed to work the slides. I want to say also that I'm happy to be here representing our School of Public Health and its 100th anniversary. So that's a very important event for us and for public health in general, because Hopkins was maybe the largest or biggest or first School of Public Health. No longer, of course, the only one. There are many. But it does give us a context for understanding the growth of science within the context of the population, within the context of community. This is what I would like to discuss today. I do want to suggest that, as the last speaker suggested, we both actually have some connections to Yale, by the way. But anyway, that placing people in their environments does not introduce problems and chaos in the studies of individuals in life course development, but adds an opportunity to study the interrelationships of life course development in context. So this is what we want to talk about today. Oops. Where am I going? What am I aiming at? Where do I go back? Here's it's moving without me. We want to talk about approaches to prevention program design, and tested in entire first grade classrooms. We want to talk about the good behavior game, which my predecessor mentioned. And we want to talk about building the GBG impact with life course prevention and treatment. That is where we go with this prevention enterprise in the context of advancing science. Let me talk for a few minutes about the framework for thinking about prevention. First of all, this is a life course slide that shows 6 stages of life across the top. The context, the social context in which people grow and develop, are family, classroom, and school, peer group, intimate, and the work scene and generational later framework. What's relevant about this is that inside each of these, there are social task demands. And the failure in those social class demands by individuals, children in this case, has important implications for what happens to them over time. And when we think about integrating genetics and behavior and success and failure, we're talking about in the specific contexts that are relevant at each stage of life. And the way these are influencing life course, oh, thank you. Can you hear me better? Anyway, inside these social contexts, social fields, are natural raters, teachers in the case of classrooms, for example, that lay out social task commands, including attention, learning, dealing with rules and authority, and a set of basic tasks to maladapt in those social contexts is to have consequences over time of considerable impact. And so what we're looking for in prevention is ways of intervening to increase the productivity, the successful adaptation of children in their environments. And we'll see how maladapting in the classroom, for example, we'll use the good behavior game as an example, one of many now tested interventions, by the way, randomized field trials of good size, how they influence the life course over time, and how that relates to, for example, drug abuse and violence and antisocial behavior and the like. What this reminds us of is that there's more than psychological, physical well-being at stake in the children. There's also this social adaptational success, level of success or failure in the main social fields. These are two actually quite different parameters of what we consider health and mental health, because we could be very poorly making it in first grade, and at the same time, this may have influence on your psychological well-being, or if you're suffering from depression in first grade, it might influence your performance in these social fields. So part of the prevention task is to understand how to improve social adaptation, and does this, in fact, then in turn improve psychological well-being, and so on. Let me say something about public health, first of all. Here you find three kinds of prevention strategies that in the US, the Institute for Medicine put out. Universal interventions, which are covering a total population. Vaccines, for example, are universal interventions where everybody gets it. Selective interventions are those that are provided for particular issues with kids having particular problems. And then you have indicated or on the edge of disorders kinds of interventions. And these relate to treatments of primary care, medical, as well as social welfare, family services, and the like. This epidemiologic population, the entire population, is of course the fundamental unit for public health study and prevention trials. The strategies now in use in prevention research and prevention services have to do with these four, as we noted several years ago. Developmental epidemiology has to do with taking a circumscribed population and following people over time and doing an early intervention and looking at the trajectories over time. And that's what the good behavior game is all about, and many others. The David Old, the prenatal intervention, prevention interventions are similar. The more immediate risk have to do with the kind of immediate, not so much a long-term life course development, but for example, getting people to use condoms before sex. The trajectory over time is very, very short. Even interventions which are in middle school to help children get through the transition into middle school from elementary school are relatively short in time. Community prevention strategies have used multiple interventions at the community level, enforcing laws, introducing varieties of kinds of potential preventive interventions, and then following communities over time using extended baselines and comparable communities without the intervention. The community societal is a very important way of looking at prevention. It has to do with simulation modeling, where you take a set of explanatory variables like drunk driving and its consequences and whether you can prevent or reduce the incidence of drunk driving through particular interventions like publishing the names of drunk drivers in the newspaper. does it influence the long-term behavior? So these are different strategies that are now in use in prevention science with their own rules for randomization and the like. We've learned a lot over the last decades in early antecedents of later problem outcomes. And so this one is particularly important, particularly in the light of the advances in the genetic field. So aggressive disruptive behavior, particularly among males, 2.5 times more frequently in the communities where we've worked. It's been repeatedly found to lead by adulthood to these outcomes. It is a marked discriminator between kids without aggressive disruptive behavior and kids with aggressive disruptive behavior. Lee Robbins, a sociologist, once called these sturdy predictors. The sturdiest one was early aggressive disruptive behavior in classrooms. In this paper, we'll talk about the importance of early aggressive behavior in predicting drugs and crime, and the impact of an early universal prevention program. It's not the good behavior game, by the way, is one of a whole set of now fully tested, strongly tested through multiple randomized field trials of the interventions we're talking about. Where am I going? Aha. Okay, I want to take a moment to tell you an outcome graph from the good behavior game. And we'll use this in the discussion that follows. First of all, these are teacher ratings of early aggressive behavior in first grade in the Baltimore trials of the good behavior game. And what we find here is that this line are the kids in control schools, the schools that got the regular program. And what you find is with each level of increment in aggressive disruptive behavior, you get an increased increment of strong sort in the probability of drug abuse dependence disorder by adulthood, by age 19 to 21. So you get an enormous relationship between the early antecedent and the long-term outcome in terms of drug abuse disorders. So you put that in context with the genetic advances, and you find a high order of environmental and genetic coming together around what happens under these circumstances. When the kids were in a prevention program, this slope, first of all, reduces at high levels of aggression in first grade. It reduces the likelihood of getting into drug abuse disorder in young adulthood. So this kind of influence of life course development and social adaptation early on becomes an extremely important framework to understand what we mean by dependency and what we can then look for in terms of malleability. This figure shows that with the good behavior game, for example, you get a reduction in this slope. So instead of 6 times the rate of drug abuse dependency, you get a rate down at less than 4 times. And what that suggests is that these kids are, number one, different than these kids, and number two, we haven't solved the entire problem. This is still 40%. And those are the kids that need more, both in explanation and in terms of intervention. But this gives you a measure of which kids, in fact, are unresponsive at what levels. In my department these days, we're now looking at how that's related to epigenetics. That is, to what extent is there some ideas of resilience or responsiveness that's as genetic as disorders may be genetic. So the experiments in the field with kids growing up and enhancing their success help us understand in the long term the context of the biologic, social, and interactive processes. A good behavior game, let me tell you a little bit about that. First of all, it's administered by a teacher to an entire first grade classroom. It's a universal program. It's like vaccines. All the kids get it. And in the trial, some kids get it, some classrooms get it, and some didn't. But in practice, all the kids get it. It's a universal program, and there are other universal programs of that sort. There are also specific programs that we'll talk about in a minute. So the good behavior game, what we intended was for the teachers to have a method to socialize kids and classroom aggressive disruptive behavior, and so in order to enhance teaching and learning. The teacher sets classroom rules, interacts with students, children respond with social adaptive or maladaptive behavior. Clarity and precision is very important in this process, and so the good behavior game is aimed at it. And notice that we're talking about an environmental person who is in fact critical to the process of success and failure in the intervention. The teacher comes into the picture. And there are preventive interventions, the good behavior game, which affect teachers, but there are similar interventions in families and in prenatal care, where prenatal parents who are teenagers, for example, in systematic programs of enhancing parenting have similar impact on long-term outcomes in David Old's kind of work. Now, it turns out that teachers dramatically vary in terms of the confidence with which they can organize classrooms. Classroom teachers are typically in the US not trained at all, literally not trained at all in how to organize and manage classrooms. So we're talking about children who in fact are in contexts in which the teacher herself has no training that's required. About 50% do it on their own, get a reasonable classroom. But if you look at classrooms halfway into first grade, you find that about 50% of the teachers have chaotic classrooms. And what we find is that, in fact, the aggression over time is 59 times higher at the level of disruption in middle school, for example, compared to teachers in a well-managed first grade classroom. So the teacher, the environmental intervention, is bringing about different responses on the part of the children, and that's where the question of the interrelationship of genes and environment become critical, where the epigenetic influence back and forth is an extremely important way of thinking about the issue. This is the inference. About 50% of teachers in Baltimore did not have the intuitive ways of managing the classroom. So they, in fact, were in a situation where the kids were not being socialized successfully. This is what the classroom rules look like for first grade, in case you're interested in remembering back. Being polite, quiet, not getting out of our seats with permission, following directions, learning, attentiveness, and not breaking rules like fighting and getting into trouble. Those are all parts of first grade tasks. Typically, the teacher running the good behavior game forms 3 teams. They're mixed behavior, half boys and half girls, and the teacher announces, we're playing the game very systematically in the beginning of the year for 10 minutes, 3 times a week, very precisely defining that this is a special event. And over the course of first grade, and the kids are rewarded for each child. So if Charlie acts up, the team is not rewarded. So it's group contingent, and becomes very precisely done by the teacher. So in the beginning, it's played 10 minutes, 3 times a week. Over the course of a year, it's a continual process that's normal in the classroom, and it's continually operating. The design for the GBG original trials in Baltimore involved 19 schools, 41 classrooms, 1,196 children across poor and slightly above poor income. 6 schools got randomly assigned a good behavior game, and 7 to an increased academic program, and 6 to the usual school program. And within the good behavior game schools, each school, 6 classrooms received good behavior game, and 6 received regular classroom management. So there's an internal control and an external control, and it's since been replicated. The classroom measure that we used involved observation and teacher ratings of classroom behavior. The follow-up, a 2-hour interview with the teacher. It's not a checklist. Ratings obtained for each child in the fall and spring of first grade, and thereafter in spring of 3rd through 7th grades, into middle school, and now into adulthood. This is the nature of what the items were that were measured in the kids. The young adult follow-up at ages 19 to 21, using the WHO version of the CD for outcome measures, and using juvenile court, prison, and school records, and the social adaptational status within each of these social fields in young adulthood. These are the broad profile of outcomes. And these studies have been replicated in other sites. Drug abuse and dependence disorders in the GBG classrooms for all males, 19% was the rate. In the standard classroom, 38%. This is at age 19 to 21, and an intervention done in first grade. For high aggressive males, the most vulnerable, 29% rate in drug abuse dependence, 83% in standard classrooms. And these are very poor communities, so these rates are not unusual in such communities. Regular smoking, you see differences of this magnitude. The high aggressive males again show the most change in the light of classroom training of the teachers. High aggressive males, the ASPD, almost by definition, is a continuing record of antisocial behavior. But the violent and criminal behavior record, you notice that 34% of kids, and these are not unusual rates in urban areas in the U.S. We're talking about 34% of the kids who are in good behavior game classrooms compared to 50% of kids having police records in other communities within the large urban settings. First grade classrooms, we're concluding, are incredibly important to later academic health, behavior, and mental development. Teachers need tested tools to manage classrooms, and typically in the U.S., teachers are not required to have, nor do schools of education teach classroom behavior management. So the socialization processes in the poorer communities are really inadequate. They are not required to have that kind of tools offered in their training. If you had to have one preventive intervention that would make sense, training teachers to do classroom management and moving kids toward effective student outcomes would be a major effort. About 50% of teachers in this urban school district needed such training. And the higher risk children are at markedly increased risk in poorly managed classrooms. In other words, kids who come in with attention deficits or come in with aggressive behavior, in fact, are most vulnerable to the absence of socializing contexts. Many of them can improve with GBG, and it is also the case that we're now beginning to do studies of looking at the genetic structure. People in my department at the School of Public Health, at the question of malleability, that is, to what extent are the genetic explanations relevant to malleability under conditions of intervention. What happens? Who is in fact responsive to the intervention? These are cost-benefit issues. These are some of the other tested programs available. There are many now. The SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S., keeps a record of successfully tested programs, and you find the good behavior game is very cheap, by the way. The trained teachers per child, an estimated cost of $204. The benefits minus the costs are important to look at. The technology for how to do these kinds of measurements and get some kind of cost-benefit ratio for preventive interventions is, of course, in itself an area of study. These ideas, going back to the original and early graphic, universals, as GBG is implemented, they can be identified, and those who don't respond are the ones who then go to selective interventions, more specialized response. And from the selective, you go to indicated, those that are on the verge of disorders. And then the next backed up is treatment, such as pediatric care, family service, and mental and juvenile justice. What this would reflect, in our opinion, is the way prevention and treatment need to be interrelated. That is, not separately done, but indeed one becomes the other. It feeds into the other on the basis of a system of systems. And that allows us also, with information systems that in fact track children over time in some areas, it allows us to understand the developmental progress of children over time, and not just their showing up or not showing up. I'm suddenly discovering that you guys over here can't see me through the screen. But anyway, the idea of all this is to produce a system of services that includes prevention at one end, universal, selective intervention, prevention next, and then served by treatment programs that have more clearly defined requirements for who needs more. And in that kind of system of systems, the community population has to have an oversight and be involved in the community base. In public health, the first rule is don't get kicked out. So if we're talking about systems and information systems tracking over time and across agencies, it's very important for us to develop a kind of community partnership which becomes in fact fundamental in public health. What I just showed you was, by the way, these papers are all about the good behavior game. Since this special issue of drug and alcohol dependence, there are several papers, including one paper I'll be interested in hearing discussion about, that we're now beginning to get attention to who responds and what are the genetic underpinnings of responses to the preventive interventions. So these are available. Anybody wants a link to the site. This is a special issue that's put out of the Good Behavior Game in 2008, and it's available. These are people who are collaborators, some of them in the school district, others at the School of Public Health at Hopkins. And it's an honor to be here, and I thank you for your attention.